Chapter 3: Extending Animal Rights via Citizenship Theory. In our introduction, we defended the necessity of supplementing and extending animal rights theory through the inclusion of various relational and differentiated animal rights, in addition to the more familiar universal rights typically defended by animal rights theorists. The first step in such a process is to develop some account of the sorts of relationships between humans and animals that can give rise to morally significant obligations and responsibilities. As we have noted, this is a complicated task, given the enormous variability in these relations. Human relations with animals differ in their beneficial and harmful impacts, level of coercion and choice, interdependencies and vulnerabilities, emotional attachments, and physical proximity. All of these and other factors seem potentially morally relevant. We need to bring some conceptual order to this confusing profusion of relations. In this chapter, we argue that citizenship theory can help in this task. Thinking about human-animal relations in light of the familiar categories of citizenship theory, such as citizens, denizens, aliens, sovereigns, can help us identify both the distinctive claims that certain animals have upon us, and also the distinctive sorts of injustices we visit upon them. We begin by explaining what we mean by citizenship theory and the conceptual resources it provides for thinking through issues of relational rights. We then consider and reject two immediate objections to applying this framework to animals. Section 1: Universal Rights and Citizenship Rights. Let us begin with citizenship in the human case. Imagine that we come across a crowd of human beings getting off a plane at an airport somewhere in our country. Without knowing anything about our more specific relationships with particular individuals in the crowd, we already know that we have certain universal obligations to them, simply because they are sentient beings with a subjective good. These are the universal rights we owe to all persons as such. For example, we cannot kill, torture, or enslave them. But as the crowd proceeds to passport control, it quickly becomes apparent that these individuals have quite different relational rights. Some of them are our co-citizens, and as such they have the unqualified right to enter and reside in the country. And once inside, they have the right to be considered full and equal members of the political community. That is to say, they are co-guardians of the country, with the right that their interests and concerns count equally with those of others in determining the direction of the country. As citizens, they are members of the people, in whose name the government acts. They have the right to share in the exercise of popular sovereignty, and society has a duty to create mechanisms of representation or consultation by which their interests will be counted equally in determining the public good or the national interest. By contrast, other passengers on the plane are tourists, foreign students, business visitors, or temporary workers who are not citizens. As such, they do not have the unqualified right to enter the country, and may need to have secured permission beforehand by obtaining a visa, for example. Even if they have permission to enter, they may not have the right to settle permanently or to work in the country. Perhaps their visa only allows them to stay for a short period of time before having to leave. As such, they are not included in the people in whose name the government acts. They do not participate in the exercise of popular sovereignty, and there is no duty to create mechanisms of representation to ensure that their interests are counted in determining the public good. Of course, to repeat, these non-citizens are still human beings and therefore have certain universal human rights. It would be impermissible to kill or enslave them, or to engage in other acts that deny their essential personhood and dignity. But there is no obligation to restructure our public spaces to make them more enjoyable for or accommodating of such non-citizens, or to restructure our political institutions to make them more accessible to such non-citizens. It may be that the hundreds of thousands of Chinese tourists who now vacation around the world would enjoy visiting New York or Buenos Aires more if there were more Chinese language street signs. And if a city wishes to attract tourists, it may well choose to make such changes, but there is no obligation on citizens to make their cities more welcoming to visitors, and it is the citizens, not the visitors, who make this collective decision about the shape of their society and its public space. The visitors do not get to vote in elections or referenda determining policies about street signs. In short, we typically distinguish between universal human rights, which are not dependent on one's relationship to a particular political community, and citizenship rights, which are dependent on membership in a particular political community. As they embark from the plane, all passengers possess the former, but only some possess the latter in relation to the country of disembarkation. And this means that their interests count in different ways. To oversimplify, we could say that the interests of citizens determine the public good of the political community, whereas the interests of non-citizens set side constraints on how political communities pursue that public good. For example, in deciding whether to build more public housing, nursing homes, or subways, it is in the interests of citizens, not those of tourists, that are determinative. However, we cannot enslave tourists to help us build those houses or subways. The universal human rights of non-citizens set constraints on how citizens of a political community pursue their public good. This is an oversimplification because, as we will see, there are various in-between categories of people who are more than mere visitors, but not, or not yet, citizens, and whose interests need to be considered in a way that is more complicated than this simple dichotomy allows. For example, immigrants who gain long-term residency acquire a certain legal and political standing that differs from that of temporary visitors, even if they do not yet have citizenship. There may also be groups who are affiliated to that state through some form of historic political association other than standard citizenship. For example, the status of American Indian tribes as domestic dependent nations, in recognition of the fact that they form a distinct sovereign people within the boundaries of a larger sovereign people. But the existence of such in-between groups with partial or overlapping citizenship status simply confirms the underlying point, namely, that the fact of being a person with universal human rights underdetermines one's legal rights and political status. And we must also remember all of the political visitors who were never allowed to get on the plane in the first place, and who therefore remain resident in some other sovereign political community. At first glance, this multiplicity of legal status may be puzzling. After all, the passengers are all human beings with the same inherent moral dignity and the same vulnerable selfhood. How then is it possible that they end up having such different legal rights? Indeed, some cosmopolitans deny that such distinctions are legitimate. They argue that everyone everywhere should automatically have their interests counted equally in political decision-making, either by creating a world of open borders in which all persons have the right to move freely across the face of the earth and take their full citizenship rights with them, and or by eliminating the very category of citizenship and simply attributing rights solely on the basis of personhood. Whether we universalize the category of citizenship or abolish it, the result would be the same. Everyone would have an equal right to get on the plane, and everyone would have the same social and political rights to settle, work, and vote as they exit the plane. But this is not the world we live in, and arguably it is not a desirable world. There are good reasons why human beings have organized themselves into distinct political communities that regulate their membership. This is partially for pragmatic reasons. Practices of democratic self-rule are easier to sustain in contexts where people see themselves as co-nationals, with a common national language and a sense of attachment to a shared national territory, rather than simply as globe-trotters who happen to be momentarily residing here rather than there. Democracy and the welfare state require levels of trust, solidarity, and mutual understanding that may be difficult to sustain in a borderless world that forgoes a sense of bounded and rooted political citizenship. The commitment to bounded citizenship is not just pragmatic. There are powerful moral values tied up in citizenship, including values of national identity and culture and of self-determination. Many people see themselves as members of collectives that have the right to govern themselves and their bounded territory, and to govern themselves in ways that reflect their national identities, languages, and histories. These aspirations to national self-government reflect deep attachments to a particular community and a particular territory, and these attachments are legitimate and worthy of respect. Indeed, part of what it means to respect people is to respect their capacity to develop such morally significant attachments and relationships, including attachments to particular individuals and communities, to territory, to ways of life, and to schemes of cooperation and self-government. Bounded citizenship expresses and enables such attachments. Any form of cosmopolitanism that denies the legitimacy of such attachments in the name of universal personhood is missing a key aspect of what it means to respect personhood, namely our capacity to develop morally significant attachments to bounded communities and territories. For these and other reasons, Virtually all major traditions of political theory, whether liberal, conservative, or socialist, have operated on the assumption that human beings organize themselves into distinct, bounded political communities. In any event, for the purposes of this book, we will assume that liberal political theory operates in a world of bounded political communities, and hence operates through a theory of citizenship as well as a theory of universal human rights. Whereas a liberal theory of universal human rights tells us what all human beings are owed in virtue of their personhood, a liberal theory of citizenship needs to tell us how we determine membership rights in distinct political communities. And this in turn requires answering a host of difficult questions. Which people should have membership rights in which political communities? How do we determine the boundaries of the various distinct and bounded political communities? How should we regulate mobility between such communities? And how should we determine the rules of interaction between various self-governing communities? Some of the most interesting work in liberal political theory over the past 30 years has been concerned with precisely these questions in citizenship theory. We are using citizenship theory in a broad sense to encompass all these questions about the definition of boundaries and membership in distinct political communities, and hence to subsume questions about rights to sovereignty and territory, regulation of international mobility, and access of newcomers to citizenship. Our central claim is that a similar sort of citizenship theory is appropriate, indeed essential in the case of animals. We argue that, as in the human case, some animals are best viewed as co-citizens in our political community, whose interests count in determining our collective good. Others are best viewed as temporary visitors, or non-citizen denizens, whose interests set side constraints on how we pursue our collective good. And yet others are best viewed as residents of their own political communities, whose sovereignty and territory we should respect. This idea of extending citizenship theory to animals will seem counterintuitive to many readers. This will undoubtedly be contested by those who deny that animals have the sort of selfhood or personhood that warrants inviolable rights. But even those animal rights theorists who advocate recognition of the moral personhood of animals have rarely suggested that they could or should be seen as citizens. For a number of reasons, people have trouble connecting the concepts of animals and citizenship. They belong to different intellectual registers. Our full response to this worry unfolds over the course of the next 4 chapters. The proof is in the pudding, and we hope to show that applying a framework of citizenship theory is not only coherent, but it helps to clarify a number of inconsistencies and dead ends that have afflicted animal rights to date. However, to begin with, it may be helpful to address 2 major roadblocks to thinking about animals and citizenship. In our view, much of the reluctance to link animals and citizenship theory rests on either A, a misunderstanding about the nature and function of citizenship, even in the human case, and or B, a misunderstanding about the nature of animal-human relationships, both as they exist today and as they might exist in the future. We briefly address these 2 misunderstandings in the rest of this chapter in order to prepare the ground for the more detailed discussions to follow. Section 2. The Functions of Citizenship. One reason why many people have trouble thinking of animals as citizens is that our everyday ideas of citizenship often carry with them connotations of active political participation. Citizens are people who vote, engage in public debate, and mobilize politically around contested public policies. At first glance, it might seem that animals are simply incapable of being citizens in that sense. Whatever status animals have, surely it cannot be that of citizens. However, this is too quick. We need to disentangle the idea of citizenship. Ideas of active political participation are just one aspect of citizenship, and we need a fuller sense of the function of citizenship in our normative political theories before we can judge how it might apply to animals. We can think of citizenship as serving at least 3 different functions in political theory, which we label rights to nationality, popular sovereignty, and democratic political agency. 1. Nationality. The first function of citizenship, and still the predominant one in international law, is to allocate individuals to territorial states. To be a citizen of country X is to have the right to reside in the territory of X and the right to return to X if you travel abroad. Everyone should have the right to live somewhere on the globe, and so international laws seek to ensure that no one is stateless. Everyone should be the citizen of some country, with a secure right of residence in it and the right to return to its territory. Note that citizenship, in this passport sense, does not yet tell us anything about the nature of the country that people are citizens of. People can be citizens of undemocratic theocracies, monarchies, military juntas, or fascist or communist dictatorships, and hence entirely lacking in the rights of political participation. This is citizenship in a very thin sense. 2. Popular sovereignty. Starting with the French Revolution, the idea of citizenship began to take on new meaning associated with a particular theory about the basis of political legitimacy. In this view, the state belongs to the people, rather than to God or some particular dynasty or caste, and citizenship is about being a member of the sovereign people. As Alan Buchanan puts it, it is part of the gospel of liberal theory that the state is not the property of dynastic or aristocratic divisions in society, but rather belongs to the people. The legitimacy of the state derives from its role as the embodiment of the inherent sovereignty of the people, in short, popular sovereignty. This was initially a revolutionary idea that had to struggle, often violently, against older theories of political legitimacy. However, today it is virtually universal and provides the essential presupposition for international law and for the United Nations. To gain recognition and legitimacy, states must define themselves as the embodiment of the sovereignty of a people. As a result, even illiberal or undemocratic regimes today insist that they embody popular sovereignty. 20th century communist and fascist dictatorships, for example, described themselves as people's republics, to emphasize that they too endorse the idea that state legitimacy flows from the will and interests of the people. Indeed, they often justified their suppression of multi-party electoral democracy on the grounds that such factionalism impedes the proper recognition and expression of the popular will, which is better left to a strong leader or vanguardist party. Citizenship in this sense means belonging to the people in whose name the state governs. Not everyone who is a national, in the first sense, is necessarily included in the people in this second sense. Slaves in the U.S., for example, were considered American nationals, at least for some purposes. They were not viewed as nationals of some other country or as stateless refugees. But they were not American citizens, in the sense of being included in the sovereign people in whose name the state governs. Many racial and religious minorities have suffered this fate of being nationals of a state, but not considered citizens in the sense of being members of the sovereign people. Think about Jews in medieval and early modern Europe. To be a citizen in this second sense reflects a more robust idea of citizenship than mere nationality, connected to a distinctly modern conception of state legitimacy. But it is not yet a fully democratic conception, since it does not entail that citizens are able to exercise their popular sovereignty through democratic means. 3. Democratic political agency. With the defeat of fascism and communism, we take for granted today that the only legitimate way to exercise popular sovereignty is through open, multi-party electoral democracy, in which individuals have rights of political dissent, political mobilization, and free political debate. Indeed, we often say that people living in non-democratic regimes are really subjects rather than citizens, even if those regimes claim to be grounded on the ideas of popular sovereignty. To be a citizen, in this new understanding, is not just to be a national of a state, as in the first meaning, or to be a member of the sovereign people in whose name the state governs, as in the second meaning, but also to be an active participant in the democratic process, or at least have the right to engage in such active participation. Citizenship in this view involves being the co-author of laws, and not just a passive recipient of the laws. It therefore rests on the assumptions about the illegitimacy of paternalistic rule, and about the capacity of individuals to represent themselves in the democratic process. The subjects of a non-democratic regime may have the benefit of the rule of law, but citizenship involves taking on the right and responsibility to shape the law, and this in turn entails assumptions about the skills, dispositions, and practices involved in political participation, including the ideas of deliberation, reciprocity, and public reason. In our view, all three of these dimensions play a vital and irreducible role when thinking about citizenship. We need to consider all three when considering whether and how to extend citizenship theory to animals. Unfortunately, in everyday parlance, and in much of the contemporary political theory literature, the focus is entirely on the third dimension. A theory of citizenship, it is widely assumed, is first and foremost a theory of democratic political agency. And it is this third sense of citizenship that seems at first glance to rule out citizenship for animals. After all, animals are not capable of engaging in the process of public reason or deliberative rationality that theorists like John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas say are essential to a democratic agency. We contest the assumption that ideas of political agency are irrelevant to animals, but before we get to that, it is important to emphasize that citizenship cannot be reduced to democratic political agency, even in the human case. If we define citizenship narrowly as the exercise of democratic political agency, we immediately exclude large numbers of humans from citizenship rights. Consider children, or people with severe mental disabilities, or people with dementia. None of them are capable of engaging in Rawlsian public reason or Habermasian deliberation. Yet they are certainly citizens of the political community in the first two senses of the term. That is, they have the right to reside in and return to the territory of the state, and they have the right to have their interests counted in determining the public good or in the delivery of public services, for example, health and education. In both of these senses, children and the mentally disabled are very different from, say, tourists or business visitors. The latter lack citizenship, and so lack rights to nationality and to be included in the sovereign people, even though they may have highly developed capacities for political agency. A tourist may have a profound ability and desire to engage in democratic agency, but that skill and desire by itself does not give them the right to reside in the country, or a right to have their interests counted in the public good. The former, by contrast, are citizens, and so have rights to nationality and to membership in the sovereign people, despite the limitations on their capacities for political agency. We cannot understand the rights of children or the mentally disabled if we ignore their status as citizens. They do not simply have universal human rights on a par with tourists or business visitors. They also have certain fundamental citizenship rights, rights that are independent of capacities for political agency. The capacity for political agency is neither necessary nor sufficient for citizenship in these first two senses. So it is important not to ignore the first two dimensions of citizenship. A central task of any citizenship theory is to explain who has rights to reside in and return to a particular territory, and to explain who is included in the sovereign people in whose name the state governs. We argue that any plausible answer to these questions must attend to animals as well as humans. Particular groups of animals should be seen as citizens of our political community in these first two senses. They have the right to reside in and return to the territory of our shared political community, and the right to have their interests included in determining the public good of the community. This is particularly true, we argue, of domesticated animals. Not all animals will be citizens of our political community, just as not all humans are citizens of our community. Some will be citizens of their own separate communities on their own bounded territories, and then our main obligation is to comply with the fair terms of inter-community interaction. Others will be residents in our community, but not full citizens, and then our main obligation is to respect their rights as side constraints on how we pursue our public good. In both the human and animal cases, a key task of citizenship theory is to explain how we determine the membership in political communities, and on that basis to determine which citizenship rights apply to which individuals. Indeed, we argue that categorizing animals within this sort of citizenship framework clarifies a number of puzzles that have historically afflicted animal rights theory. So even if we accepted that animals are incapable of democratic political agency, it would not follow that citizenship theory is irrelevant to thinking about their rights. However, we do not in fact accept the premise that animals are incapable of political agency. This third dimension of citizenship is an essential feature of modern understandings of citizenship, and in many ways can be seen as a culmination or fulfillment of the first two senses. Any conception of citizenship that stopped with rights to nationality and popular sovereignty without addressing rights of political agency would be an impoverished idea of citizenship. As we noted earlier, ideas of agency are now so central to our understanding of citizenship that we are inclined to say that where people are denied agency, they are really subjects rather than citizens. The ideal of citizenship involves a deep commitment to political agency. We share this commitment, but it is important to clarify the nature of it. It is a serious mistake to treat political agency as a threshold or criterion that determines who is a citizen, such that those who are incapable of this or that form of agency are relegated to a status of non-citizenship. As we have seen, this would have the perverse effect of excluding children and the mentally disabled from citizenship. Rather, we should think of this third dimension as a value, or rather a cluster of related values, that informs how we treat those who, on prior and independent grounds, we recognize as citizens. Citizenship theory in this third dimension affirms values such as autonomy, agency, consent, trust, reciprocity, participation, authenticity, and self-determination, and says that part of what it is to treat people as citizens is to treat them in ways that we affirm and respect these values. We agree that to treat someone as a citizen involves facilitating and enabling their political agency. This commitment rests on a recognition of the dangers of paternalism, the harms of coercion, and the value to individuals of being able to act upon their own desires and attachments. Consider, for example, the contemporary disability movement. As many commentators have noted, this movement has adopted citizenship as the central organizing principle and benchmark, demanding to be treated as citizens rather than clients or patients in the care of guardians. As such, it is widely counted as one of the paradigmatic instances of contemporary citizenship movements. Obviously, citizenship in this context refers to the third dimension of agency, since people with disabilities typically have already been counted as citizens in the first two senses. They have had rights to reside and return to a country, and have been considered as members of the people in whose name the state governs. However, until recently, people with disabilities have been treated as passive recipients of paternalistic policies decided by their guardians, with little or no input into this process. Against this older model, the disability movement has insisted on rights to agency, participation, and consent, captured in the well-known movement slogan, "Nothing about us without us." This is the core claim of people with disabilities to be treated as citizens. Yet what it means for people with disabilities to be treated as citizens is complex, particularly in the case of those with intellectual disabilities. It is not just a matter of inviting them to engage in Rawlsian public reason or Habermasian deliberation, since they may be unable to communicate linguistically. Nor is it a matter of giving them the right to vote for a particular political party or for a particular legislative proposal, since they may be unable to comprehend political platforms or legal proposals, or to formulate judgments about how these platforms would impinge upon their own interests. If they are to participate, it will require new models of dependent agency, or supported decision-making for non-communicating citizens. Older models of paternalistic guardianship are being challenged by newer models in which the goal is to find ways of eliciting a person's sense of their subjective good, often through embodied rather than verbal communication. In these new models, people with mental disabilities can enact their citizenship, but it requires other people, whom Francis and Silvers call collaborators, to help construct a script of their conception of the good life, drawing on both verbal and nonverbal expressions of preference. As they put it, quote, "The collaborator's role is to attend to these expressions, to fit them together into an account of ongoing preferences that constitutes a personalized idea of the good, to work out how to realize this good under existing circumstances," end quote, and to bring this information into the political process so that their views can shape ongoing debates about social justice. Some of the most interesting work in citizenship theory in the past few years has focused on this idea of enabling and exercising citizenship through dependent, assisted, or interdependent agency. This may sound like an exceptional case, but in fact we all go through stages of our lives when we are in need of such assisted agency, whether as infants or children, and when temporarily incompetent due to illness or in old age. Immigrants may need translation to help to understand political debates. People with speech or hearing impediments may need accommodations or assistance if they are to participate. Any plausible conception of citizenship must acknowledge the value of agency, but it must also acknowledge that capacities for agency expand and contract over time, and vary across persons, and that a central task of a theory of citizenship is to support and enable what is often a partial and fragile achievement. This needs to be central to, and not incidental to, a theory of citizenship. As Francis and Silvers put it, quote, "The difference between the majority of people and the minority of dependent agents is the extent of the dependency, not the fact of it." End quote. Stated another way, political agency, as a third dimension of citizenship, should be seen as something that inheres a relationship among citizens, not as an attribute of individuals that exists prior to their interaction. It is not that people are first agents, and therefore are accorded citizenship. Nor do we strip citizenship from our co-nationals who are temporarily or permanently limited in their cognitive abilities or rational agency. Rather, entering into relations of citizenship is, at least in part, entering into relationships that involve facilitating the agency of our co-citizens at all stages of their life course and at all levels of mental competence. This new field is opening up important possibilities for citizenship amongst people with disabilities, but we believe it equally opens up the possibility of citizenship for animals, at least for those domesticated animals with whom we live in close proximity and whom we have rendered dependent on us through domestication. Here, too, we can elicit a range of expressions of preference to construct scripts of domesticated animals' interests, and can bring those into the political process to help determine ongoing fair terms of interaction. Domesticated animals, we argue, should be seen as co-citizens in this sense, with the right to be represented through forms of dependent agency in our political decision-making. As we show in Chapter 4, insofar as proposals regarding the ethical treatment of domesticated animals do not enable citizenship in this sense, and this is true of some proposals from animal rights theorists, amongst those who do not advocate extinction for domesticated animals, they are prone to perpetuating relations of exploitation, oppression, or unwarranted paternalism. As with the first two senses of citizenship, not all animals will be co-citizens in the sense of active political participants. Constructing relations of dependent agency involves a degree of intimacy and proximity that is neither feasible nor desirable for animals in the wild. But recall that this is true in the human case as well. Citizenship is a relationship that holds amongst those who cohabit a common territory and who are governed by common institutions. That is true for both humans and animals. We argue that citizenship is both possible and morally required for those domesticated animals whom we have brought into our society, and is neither necessary nor desirable for those wild animals who should be seen as belonging instead to their own sovereign communities. And, as in the human case, there are yet other groups of animals who fall into in-between categories, neither fully inside nor fully outside our political communities, and hence with their own distinctive status. In all these cases, the citizenship status of animals, just as in the human case, is determined not by their cognitive capacities, but by the nature of their relationship to a particular bounded political community. In short, the common view that animals cannot be citizens rests on a misunderstanding about the nature of citizenship, even in the human case. Many people assume that animals cannot be citizens because A, citizenship is about the exercise of political agency, and B, political agency requires cognitively sophisticated capacities for public reason and deliberation. Neither claim is correct, even for human beings. Citizenship is about more than political agency, and political agency takes forms other than public reason. Citizenship has multiple functions, and all of them are, in principle, applicable to animals. Citizenship operates to allocate individuals to territories, to allocate membership in sovereign peoples, and to enable diverse forms of political agency, including assisted and dependent agency. Not only is it conceptually coherent to apply all three citizenship functions to animals, but we argue in the remaining chapters that it is the only coherent way to make sense of our moral obligations. Versions of animal rights theory that are unable or unwilling to categorize animals through these citizenship frames, we show, are incapable of recognizing morally salient differences in our relationship with different animals, and as a result, are incapable of recognizing specific forms of oppression against certain animals. Section 3. The diversity of animal-human relationships. Reluctance to apply citizenship theory to animals does not just stem from an unduly narrow understanding of citizenship in the human case. It also, and perhaps more importantly, stems from an unduly narrow understanding of how animals relate to human communities. Adopting a citizenship framework presupposes that animals and humans will inevitably be linked through diverse relations of interaction and interdependency, and the task of citizenship theory is to evaluate the justice of these relations and to construct them on fairer terms. As we discuss below, there are literally dozens of such patterns of interaction and interdependency for which citizenship theory is potentially relevant. However, in everyday understanding, and in much of the academic literature on animal rights, animals are seen as falling into just two possible categories: wild and domesticated. The former are free and independent, inhabiting the wilderness out there, unless they have been captured for zoos, exotic pet keeping, or research purposes. The latter are captive and dependent, living under our management at home as domesticated pets, in the laboratory as experimental subjects, or on farms as livestock. If one starts from this dichotomy, as many animal rights theorists do, then it may seem that the idea of citizenship for animals is at best irrelevant and at worst a pretext for continued oppression. According to classic animal rights theory, animals who are wild, human independent, or capable of living so, should be protected from human intervention. We should let them be to get on with their lives. Wild animals do not need to be included within human citizenship regimes. Rather, what they need is precisely to be protected from interaction with or interdependency on human beings. The idea of citizenship might seem more relevant to domesticated animals, who have been rendered dependent on human beings and who have lost their ability to live independently in the wild. Extending citizenship status to domesticated animals might ensure that they are treated justly in a mixed human-animal society. However, many animal rights theorists deny that the justice is possible for animals that have been bred to be dependent on and forced to participate in human society. The status of dependency is said to be inherently exploitative and oppressive. Thus, some animal rights theorists call for a complete end to the domestication and extinction of domesticated species. Reform is not possible. According citizenship to domesticated animals in this view would simply serve to give a veneer of morality to an inherently oppressive relationship of paternalistic dependency and forced participation in a human world. So, for many animal rights theorists, the idea of extending citizenship to animals is irrelevant and potentially pernicious. Citizenship would be an appropriate framework if the goal were to develop better or fairer patterns of interaction and interdependency amongst humans and animals. But for many animal rights theorists, it is the very fact of interaction and interdependency that is the problem. And the solution is to end these patterns, first by leaving wild animals alone, and second by abolishing relations with domesticated animals. In an ideal world, all animals will be wild or liberated, living freely and separately from humans, with no animals having citizenship claims on humans or vice versa. We believe that this picture of a world without sustained human-animal interaction and interdependency is fatally flawed, descriptively and normatively. The most obvious problem is that it ignores the many types of animal-human relations that do not fit either the wild or domesticated categories. Consider squirrels, sparrows, coyotes, rats, or Canada geese. These liminal animals are not domesticated, but nor are they living independently of humans in the wilderness. They are living here amongst us in our garages, backyards, and local parks, and indeed have often sought us out because of the benefits of living close to humans. They exhibit their own distinctive patterns of interaction and interdependence that differ from those of both wilderness and domesticated animals. These liminal animals cannot be dismissed as anomalies. There are millions of them, and many of our most difficult ethical dilemmas arise in relation to them. Yet animal rights theory provides virtually no guidance regarding these cases. But even if we focus solely on wilderness and domesticated animals, there will be ongoing relations of interaction and interdependency linking such animals with humans that need to be regulated by norms of justice. In relation to domesticated animals, it is true that domesticated animals should cease to be enslaved, and as we see in Chapter 4, many current proposals for reforming the status of domesticated animals are just a veneer for continued exploitation. However, it is premature to claim that the best or only way to redress the injustices suffered by domesticated animals is to seek their extinction. Historic processes of domestication were unjust, as is the existing treatment of domesticated animals. But histories of injustice, in both the human and animal case, often generate ongoing responsibilities to try and create new relationships that comply with the norms of justice. We argue in Chapter 5 that such relationships are possible, and that pursuing the extinction of domesticated animals is an abdication of our history and ongoing responsibilities to them. In terms of wild animals, it is true that animals in the wilderness often need to be left alone. But even wild animals exist in complex relations of interdependency with humans that need to be regulated by norms of justice. Consider animals that feed off a single plant species that is disappearing due to acid rain or climate change. These animals are, in one sense, being left alone. No one may be hunting or capturing them, or even entering their habitat, yet they are extremely vulnerable to human activity. More generally, it is a fatal mistake to think that our duties to wild animals can be met by designating no-go zones, for example, protected wilderness areas. For one thing, it is simply impossible to turn the full extent of wild animals' habitats into a no-go zone. When scientists in 1991 put a radio collar on a wolf and tracked its movements, it covered 40,000 square miles in 2 years, starting in Alberta, Canada, moving south to Montana, west to Idaho and Washington, and then north to British Columbia before returning to Alberta. Wolves are wild animals who avoid humans, and some of the movement of this wolf was through protected wilderness, for example, national parks. But we could hardly turn all 40,000 square miles into a no-go zone for humans. Most of this territory is crisscrossed by roads, railways, farms, power lines, fences, and indeed international borders, creating multiple forms of human impact on wolves and other animals. The vast majority of wild animals live in or move across areas that are directly influenced by humans. According to the Wildlife Conservation Society and the Center for International Earth Science Information Network at Columbia University, 83% of the Earth's land surface is influenced directly by human beings, whether through human land uses, human access from roads, railways, or major rivers, electrical infrastructure, indicated by lights detected at night, or direct occupancy by human beings at densities above 1 person per square kilometer. Wild animals live in the wild, but they rarely live in pristine wilderness untouched by humans, and we need a theory of animal rights that addresses these inevitable entanglements between humans and wild animals. This is not to say that we should stop trying to establish or expand protected wilderness zones. Indeed, our citizenship-based sovereignty model developed in Chapter 6 is intended to support that project by providing a clearer rationale for the territorial rights of wild animals than is currently available within animal rights theory. However, we need to recognize that we cannot solve the problem of wild animals simply through designating no-go zones where we let them be. Given the relentless human expansion and habitat destruction that has already taken place, such protected zones will almost certainly be too small to cover the full range of habitat that many wild animals need. And so predictably, wild animals have adapted to the human influences on their environment, such that certain forms or degrees of coexistence are now natural for them. As Gary Kalor argues, human domination of the planet has in effect turned human independence into a losing evolutionary strategy, leading to an age of interdependent forms. Of course, this sort of interdependency is different from that characterizing either domesticated or liminal animals. But as we will see, it is a relationship that raises its own distinctive issues of justice. We need some way of conceptualizing this field of coexistence and interdependency between humans and wild animals. In short, animal human relationships come in a remarkable array of forms, with varying levels of interaction, mutual vulnerability, and interdependency. And in all of these cases, we argue citizenship theory, with its differentiated and relational model of rights, is needed to supplement the universal rights that animal rights theory has focused on to date. The failure of animal rights theory to consider a citizenship model, we believe, is largely due to its failure to recognize the inevitability of such diverse forms of human animal relations. But this just pushes back the problem a level. What explains this failure to recognize the enduring nature of human animal relationships? After all, the idea that animals and humans belong in hermetically separated compartments, with humans here in humanized environments and animals out there in untouched wilderness, cannot survive even cursory inspection. It is contradicted by our everyday experience of constant human animal interaction, and at odds with all the scientific studies of such interactions. How then did this idea take hold in animal rights theory? An uncharitable explanation is that it took hold because it allows animal rights theorists to sidestep a number of thorny dilemmas that arise once we acknowledge this enduring nature of human animal interdependence. A more charitable answer is that animal rights theorists have focused on the most egregious violations of animal rights, leaving positive and relational duties for another day. But the full answer, we believe, lies in some deeper misunderstandings about the underlying factors that generate these enduring patterns of human animal interdependence and interaction. The simplistic division of animals into free and independent animals inhabiting the wilderness and captive and dependent domesticated animals living with humans rests on a series of widespread myths that we need to be continually guarded against. We mention three such myths relating to agency, dependency, and geography. In perpetuating these myths, animal rights theory reflects a more general cultural blindness regarding animal-human relations. Agency. The traditional animal rights theory view assumes that humans are the primary agents or initiators of human-animal relationships. Humans either choose to leave animals alone to get on with their lives, or choose to hunt, capture, or breed them in order to serve human wants and desires. If we stopped interfering with animals, relationships between humans and animals would largely cease. In reality, however, animals also exhibit various forms of agency. Animals can choose to avoid human settlement, but they can also choose to seek it out for the opportunities it offers. There are literally millions of liminal animals who seek out areas of human settlement. And they can also choose whether to avoid individual humans or to seek them out for food, assistance, shelter, companionship, and other needs. Given a range of non-coercive alternatives, animals can express preferences, i.e., vote with their feet, about how to live their lives and under what circumstances, if any, to engage with humans. A crucial task of any theory of animal rights is to consider what justice requires in terms of these animal-initiated relations with humans, as well as what justice requires in terms of human-initiated interactions with animals. To be sure, the capacity for agency seems to vary widely amongst animals. An adaptive and social animal like a dog, rat, or crow is capable of great behavioral flexibility, of choosing between options depending on context and needs. Other animals are more tightly scripted. They are niche specialists who cannot readily adapt to changes in their environment, either because their needs are inflexible or because they lack the cognitive flexibility to explore alternatives. But any plausible theory of animal rights must be attentive to the potential for animal-initiated forms of interaction and for animal agency in response to human-initiated interaction. Dependence/independence. The traditional animal rights theory view tends to misinterpret the nature of animals' dependence on or independence of human beings. As we have seen, the traditional animal rights theory view is that wild animals live independently of humans, and therefore need to simply be left alone, whereas domesticated animals are dependent upon humans, and therefore are condemned to relations of oppressive subservience. In reality, dependency is a multidimensional continuum which varies for every individual according to activity and context and over time. There are important respects in which animals living in the most remote wilderness are nonetheless dependent on human beings, and there are important respects in which domesticated animals can exercise independence. In thinking about dependency, it is useful to distinguish two dimensions: inflexibility and specificity. A mouse living in a cage in Johnny's bedroom is dependent in both inflexible and specific ways. Her dependence is inflexible because she is without alternative options if Johnny fails to feed her. She can't transport herself to another location or start deriving nutrition from fun wheels or cardboard tunnels. Her dependence is also highly specific. She is dependent on one particular human or one particular human family to feed her. Contrast this with a rat living at the city dump. The rat is dependent on humans for its food source, but not on any specific humans. It doesn't matter to the rat whether Johnny and his family drop off garbage in any given week, as long as humans collectively don't close up the landfill and withdraw all their garbage at the same time. And even if the dump were to close entirely, the rat's dependency isn't entirely inflexible. He may be able to relocate and find alternative food sources. Viewed this way, domesticated animals often exhibit dependence along the specificity dimension. That is, they are typically dependent on specific animals to feed and shelter them. By contrast, wild and liminal animals, virtually by definition, are not dependent on specific human beings for food, shelter, or other basic needs. But notice that wild animals are often more dependent on the inflexibility dimension. Many animals in the wilderness are niche specialists who are intensely vulnerable to even the indirect side effects of human activity. Consider a bird species which migrates along a specific route where humans have erected a significant barrier. The birds can't figure out how to get around the barrier and continue on their way, they are in trouble. Or consider polar bears, whose ice floe habitat is being lost to global warming. Or monarch butterflies who are dependent on one food source, the milkweed. These animals may live in the wilderness, but even if they are left alone in the sense that no one attempts to hunt, capture, or domesticate them, they are nonetheless highly vulnerable to any human activity that alters their environment. By contrast, many liminal and domesticated animals, though living amongst human beings, may actually be less inflexibly dependent on them. Domestic and liminal animals are often adaptive generalists rather than niche specialists, who can readily respond to changes in the natural or built environment. Consider raccoons and squirrels and their amazing ability to adapt to and defeat every new generation of squirrel-proof feeder or garbage bin enclosure. Consider the feral dogs of Moscow, Palermo, and the countless other cities who demonstrate remarkable skills in adapting to a constantly changing urban environment. In this respect, as Calor notes, certain wild animals are much more dependent on humans than many liminal or domesticated animals. Some of the animals we think of as majestic, fierce, and free, such as the tigers of Nepal, are in fact dependent on highly elaborate and costly human schemes of rewilding intervention, whereas many liminal animals can survive, even flourish, in the face of almost total human indifference to them. We need a much more sophisticated understanding of these diverse forms of interdependence. Spatial dimensions of human-animal relations. Cultural sociologists and cultural geographers have long emphasized that modern societies operate with a very specific conception of space. Certain spaces, cities, suburbs, industrial, and agricultural zones, are defined as human rather than animal, as cultural rather than natural, or as developed rather than wilderness. These dichotomies underpin our, quote, culturally derived modernist conceptions of proper, morally appropriate spatial relations between animals and society, end quote. In this cultural imaginary, companion animals stay safely on the leash rather than becoming feral. Wild animals stay in zoos or in pristine wilderness far removed from animals, and livestock stay. Whenever any animal is found outside its proper, morally appropriate space, it is seen as matter out of place and hence as morally problematic. Quote, Urban living has resulted in the incorporation of animals into the private sphere as pets, or urban culture has removed them to a real or imaginary wild or some rural past. End quote. And if animals cross the boundary, they are, quote, doomed to be considered morally transgressive as they transgress on the spaces that we have defined as for humans only, end quote. This high modernist conception of space systematically distorts our understanding of human-animal relations. It recognizes the existence of pets in cities, if safely leashed, but it ignores the non-domesticated animals around us. And so liminal animals come into view only when their numbers or behavior turn them into pests. In other words, they are visible only when they become a problem, but invisible as ubiquitous members of the community. We have paid remarkably little attention to the diversity of these animals, the kinds of spaces they inhabit, and the ways we interact with them, from the mice who inhabit our houses to the sparrows and feral pigeons who scavenge in city cores, and the deer and coyotes who thrive in the suburbs, to the countless species who have evolved in symbiosis with traditional agricultural practices, for example, the birds, rodents, and small mammals who feed on agricultural crops, and the larger mammals and raptors who prey on them in turn. There are some spatial complexities to our relations with wild domesticated animals. Some wild animals live truly remote from human settlement, like the eel-pout fish living deep in the thermal vents of the Pacific Ocean. Others, however, live in little pockets of wilderness completely surrounded by human activity. And many wild animals spend at least some of their time negotiating human environments because of the way our roads, shipping lanes, flight paths, fences, bridges, and tall buildings interrupt their travel and migration routes. In the case of domesticated animals, some, like our pet mice or goldfish, spend their entire lives in micro-worlds inside our houses. Some, like dogs, accompany us out onto the streets and into public spaces. Others, like horses, tend to live in rural areas because their housing and exercise needs are so much more expansive. These spatial dimensions of human-animal relations interact with the agency and interdependency dimensions identified above in ways that create a dizzying array of relationships, with diverse causal origins, differing types of interaction, and varying levels of vulnerability. And all of these variations are important for identifying the relevant issues of justice and for assessing our moral responsibilities. The simplistic dichotomy of wild and domesticated animals and the accompanying call to simply let animals be needs to be replaced with a more complex matrix of relationships and a more complex set of moral prescriptions. Indeed, a chief goal of this book is to dismantle the simple wild-domestic dichotomy and to replace it with what Jennifer Wolk describes as, quote, a matrix of animals who vary with respect to the extent of physical or behavioral modification due to human intervention and types of interaction with people, end quote. In the next 4 chapters, we highlight several distinctive patterns of human-animal relationships and show how each of them can be illuminated by drawing upon citizenship theory.